So my name's Hester Barron. I am a historian of modern Britain at the University of Sussex. I'm a member of the Speaking Citizens team, and I'm going to be chairing today's roundtable, in which we're asking the question, what can we learn from other times and places? And to answer this, we've got some fabulous panelists lined up. So we've got Dr. Joanne Paul, who is going to be sharing her insights from her research on early modern England. Joanne is based at Sussex University, where she is senior lecturer in early modern history. And she works on the cultural and intellectual history of the 16th and 17th centuries. Skipping forward a couple of centuries, we have Dr. Tom Wright, who will be talking to us about 19th century Britain. Tom is also based at Sussex, where he is a reader in rhetoric, and he also leads the Speaking Citizens project. And he's a cultural historian of 19th century Britain and America, and specialises in the role of rhetoric and speaking in politics, education, and the history of ideas. And then to take us on into the 20th century, we have Alan Howe, who has been one of the leading figures in Oracy education across the UK for several decades now. He's currently a research associate for Oracy Cambridge, and he's going to be sharing his thoughts based on his experience at the chalk face, as it were. So we'll hear from a number of historical perspectives, but this roundtable is also about place and what we can learn from the practice of Oracy elsewhere. And so we're joined by our fourth panellist, by Karin Barber, who is Professor Emeritus in Cultural Anthropology at the University of Birmingham. And her research interests are in Africa and everyday culture, with most of her work based on the Yoruba speaking area of southwestern Nigeria. So we'll hear from a number of, I'm very excited to hear what our panelists have to say on a number of questions, and we'll hear various responses from the panel first. We're recording this session, so thanks to the panelists for that, so it will be made available later. But I'll also keep a bit of time at the end for questions from the floor. So if you'd like to ask a question, please put it into the Q&A, and I'll do my best to keep an eye on it as we're going through and put some of the questions to the panelists at the end. What can we learn from different times and places? So just to the panelists, a very broad starter question to kick things off at the beginning. And Joanne and Tom, you're both working on periods before the word Oracy was coined. So Joanne, you talk about rhetoric. Tom, I know you've got rhetoric in your job title, but I've also heard you talk about elocution. But obviously both of you are thinking about the way those concepts were practiced in the past. So why might it be useful for teachers or people in government or others who are interested in Oracy in 2022 to know about how this concept was practiced and understood in your historical time period? So maybe Joanne, if we could start with you and hear from early modern England.
Yeah, chronologically, I always tend to go first.
We're historians. That's what we do.
So as you say, I work mostly on the 16th century in England. So I work on Renaissance humanism. The humanists were all about learning and curriculum, and in particular, how to make learning useful for what we might think of as the real world. And it's really that sits at the roots of our modern humanities courses, the discipline of the humanities. And central to their curriculum, and maybe less so to ours, which is, I think, one of the lessons here, was a focus on rhetoric. And by rhetoric, what they meant, and probably what we mean today as well, is persuasive speech, how to move people. And this was both how to move people to your point of view, to actually move someone in terms of their position on a topic, but also how to move people emotionally, right? When you're moved to tears or moved to rage. So it's all about stirring the emotions, really. And because of this sort of movement that comes out of rhetoric, it was seen as incredibly powerful by I call them my Renaissance humanists, even more so than any physical force. And they were particularly fond of the pen is mightier than the sword, that sort of imagery and idea. And so it was seen as essential for participation in what we might now think of as the public sphere, as politics, both in terms of being able to use rhetoric, but also to be able to identify it. And this comes, I think, from a sort of Republican drive, this idea that politics should be participatory, that people should be able to engage in politics. And so in terms of lessons for today, living in a sort of modern democratic state, this perspective that rhetoric is essential to full political participation, I think is something we should be reviving and thinking about, alongside a recognition that not being able to understand rhetorical tools that are being used and not being able to participate in rhetorical discussions is both disempowering to the individual and dangerous to the polity as a whole. So this link, I guess, between rhetoric and politics.
Thank you. I'll carry on from that.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
Yeah. Thanks, Joanne. So as Hester said, I researched the history of public speaking and rhetoric. And the way I come at Oracy is might be summarized in one phrase, which is the world the 3 R's forgot. So we've all heard that phrase, the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. And it's that notion of the core set of skills. And it's a notion that goes right back to the beginning of compulsory education in the 1870s and the Forster Report. And it's a notion that education ministers continue to brandish as the key to traditional education, particularly Gove and Williamson and in the 2010s. And I think it's important to look back to Victorian education to see that actually there was a bigger picture. Yes, there was this passive world of obedient rows of school children, the world of Dickens's Hard Times, but there was this whole world that the 3 R's forgot. There was this world that revolved around taking speaking and listening seriously. There was a massive popular interest in speaking, groups and bodies and institutions and social movements devoted to getting together and doing what we would now call oracy. One of the words that they used was, as Joanne was talking about, rhetoric, but another was elocution. And in some of the panels we've had today, we've already heard that word being used in quite a derogatory way. And that's how we use it today. I think we know what we mean. We mean changing your accent, polishing something, but it meant something very different back then. It meant a bigger sense of performance, of using the body, of becoming more confident and presenting yourself to the world, which is why some people called it vocal culture. It was this entire culture around the voice. And it was far more central to being an expected part of what being educated meant. It was on a footing with maths or history or geography. So this wasn't a trivial concern, and it was something that crossed classes. That was something that maybe I'll talk about a bit later, that working class people got involved in as much as the elite. And that's why I think it's important to know this history of elocution and the world the 3 R's forgot, because if we know that, then we won't buy the claim that oracy is not traditional, which is something you hear from successive education secretaries. There were, in fact, multiple traditions that valued and championed speaking. There is never just one version of what traditional means. In fact, the idea of traditional is simply political rhetoric that's seeking to defend a conservative view of education, to diminish progressive ideas and make them seem newfangled, when in fact, oracy is just as traditional as anything else.
Thanks, Tom. And thanks, Joanne. Alan, obviously you've kind of lived through some of this, and not through some of Joanne and Tom's research, but some of the development of oracy since the term was coined in the 1960s, and lived some of that in your own career, and obviously have can give us a perspective on that much more recent history of it. Can you tell us a bit about how the concept has evolved since that word started to be used in the 1960s?
Yes, thank you. I mean, it was Andrew Wilkinson who invented it in 1965 in a publication called Spoken English. And I think if you like, the journey that Oracy has been on since then has been one of fits and starts. That's how I'd characterize it. So it's not been a smooth transition to some kind of golden land of Oracy that we're at now. It's been much more muddled than that. There were some very important insights early on. I mean, Andrew Wilkinson's coining of the word was because he felt that Oracy had been neglected in education. I've often characterized it as the Cinderella of the language modes. As Thomas said, the idea that the 3 R's forgot. You know, Cinderella, first up, last to bed, does all the hard work, but is never invited to anything particularly important. When it comes to the business of education, you know, curriculum assessment, the written word tends to hold forth. So Wilkinson wanted to give it the same kind of status. And some of the things that he said in that early publication, I think, are really very significant. He talked about Oracy as being not a subject, but a condition of learning in all subjects. And I think that's a really important insight. And he talked about it as not being a skill, but an essential element in humanizing the species. So in a sense, where we start in 65, I think is still where we still need to be in many of this. I think you can see Oracy developing in a number of, distinct phases. So there was a period in the 60s, 70s, where the groundbreaking work of language in education, often coming from universities, I'm talking about James Breton, Douglas Barnes, Harold Rosen, people who were doing a lot of really interesting work into the importance of children using their expressive language to grapple with the curriculum, what Douglas Barnes calls working on your understanding through talk. That held sway and was a very important shift of emphasis away from rhetoric, if you like, or elocution, towards harnessing the power that the language that the children already have and bring to school in the service of their learning. So that was very significant. But there was also a recognition, I think, at the time that the language of school could be a barrier to that often children who were bringing non-standard varieties of English to school were encountering the language of education and finding there was a gap and that they weren't able to access academic language particularly well. And that sometimes led to what you might call a deficit model of Oracy, a view that children lack something, that they haven't quite got the right kind of skills, or they aren't able to operate in the right kind of way with the spoken language. And that, I think, that deficit model of spoken language is still around. It's not very helpful, but I think it's still there. So an example, if you like, of not an evolution from that, but something which has stayed with us. There were big national developments in the 1980s, early 90s, with various Oracy projects, a big national Oracy project. And what that gave us, I think, was an understanding of how you convert the concept of Oracy into the practice of the classroom. Very practical stuff around promoting it in schools, not just particular kinds of spoken language skills, but also narrative and arguments, or how to develop early language development with very young children, or the place of rules and roles in developing your ability to discuss together in groups and so on, how to evaluate and assess talk. That was a very distinct phase, which then got overlaid when the national curriculum came along and started to promote written language more strongly than Oracy. Where we are now, I think, is we're in a much better place for a number of reasons. We've got a very good map of the spoken language now, a framework of skills that's been developed, which is available through Oracy Cambridge, through Voice 21, which gives teachers a much clearer sense of what you're trying to promote, what's the range of skills. We've got a much stronger sense of the importance of dialogic teaching and learning as part of classroom practice. In other words, the teacher orchestrating whole class conversation with children, where you're, if you like, more equals. It's not teacher voice and a few children's voices just slotting in the odd word here and there. It's a conversation of equals through dialogue. So I think that's a very significant development that's been happening in the last few years that's given fresh impetus to Oracy. So I think we're in a position now where we can describe Oracy as being two sides of the same coin. How to learn through talk and using talk as a means of learning, and the need to learn to talk, to build up the skills. Our concept of Oracy, I think, has evolved to having a much more rounded view and to incorporate listening just as much as we might incorporate speaking. So we've got a clearer understanding of the landscape of Oracy. It's less a nebulous concept, which I think gives us some strength. In 65, Wilkinson wrote and I'm quoting, "The main job of the teacher is to the main job of the teacher is to create situations which call forth increasing powers of utterance." And I think that's an important insight, and it's absolutely vital, but it's not enough. What I think we could argue now is we also need the teacher and the school to be able to teach oracy skills much more explicitly, so that children, for many children, school is their only chance of developing the ability to develop a persuasive argument or to describe a process clearly, and so on and so forth. And it needs to be taught not in isolation, but embedded within the curriculum. So if you like, where I think we are with oracy now is an understanding that children need to learn to talk like a scientist, talk like a mathematician, talk like a dancer, talk like a musician, so that they develop a much wider range of skills across a wide range of purposes.
Thank you. Karin, we've heard what we can learn from other times, or heard some perspectives from thinking about different decades or different centuries. You can obviously give us some insight into what we can learn from other places. So what's your, how do the Yoruba people, where do the Yoruba people learn or practice oracy?
No, thank you. Yoruba of Nigeria are an example of the many cultures in the world where literacy is widespread and literacy is highly valued. People want literacy, but at the same time, there are flourishing oral traditions of verbal arts, poetry, narrative, proverbs, riddles, and so on, which have continued to evolve. So people are still adapting them and inventing new ones. So this is the case in southwestern Nigeria. The Yoruba are famous for having adopted literacy and Western style schooling quite early on in the mid-19th century, and with great enthusiasm. But up till today, people are still learning oral genres, and they are very much embedded in them. They recognize them, they know how to quote them, and so on. So people don't learn oral arts in school. They learn them from the day they're born. When babies are given their names in a family ceremony, they're plugged in to the traditions of oral poetry, which tell them the origin of the family and their place in the community, their identity. Then as they grow up, they learn more and more oral skills, such, first of all, as how to greet other people, which is incredibly important. You can greet people for hundreds of different situations with specific, very choice kinds of greeting. Then they have to learn how to carry messages for their elders and how to go and bargain in the marketplace, which is a whole separate set of rhetorical skills. And then when they become adults, they have to learn how to hold their own in a dispute. And finally, if they make it to becoming an elder, they gain kudos by being able to cite proverbs appropriately. So it's a lifelong acquisition of skills appropriate to the stage they're at. So I think maybe 2 points might come out of this, which could perhaps be useful for us to pay attention to. And the first is that the proper way of speaking, the way that's regarded as persuasive and elegant and so on, is in continuity with valued art forms. It's not a separate domain, a technique that you learn in school in order to achieve something. It's part of the arts of the community. And in fact, if you think about it, this might also be true in a less striking way in the UK, that our own old traditions obviously are not quite as flourishing as in Western Nigeria, but prestigious literary forms like poetic traditions always have an oral dimension. And the fact that the popularity of rap and spoken word poetry and slam events suggests that that oral dimension of verbal arts is still there and could be reactivated or at least recognized more than it is in schools at the moment. The second thing is that oracy is not just a subject which you can demarcate and learn separately from other topics. It's a lifelong skill and art which could be recognized and enhanced in schools, but which is also learned from parents and from the community. And I would think there are a lot of skilled speakers whom children could be encouraged to learn from, but they are not usually. They're not told that this is something that's valuable and that they should pay attention to. So those are two things which may be strengthened by looking at other cultures where oracy is still very vibrant and flourishing.
Thanks, Karin. And I mean, one of the things that comes out there is that sense of it being a lifetime, as you say, from the day they're born until old age, that's part of the learning process. And I suppose another thing that comes out is the fact of it being part of daily life and daily relationships and based in the family. So I'm wondering what the role, whether that's something we see in the past as well, in terms of the role of the family and the role of society outside of the educational setting, how people or where people learn oracy. Tom, perhaps could you speak to that?
Yeah, I can. So I'm talking about the era of the onset of compulsory education, let's say the 1870s. And the key difference between now and then is that education was far shorter. It stretched from 5 to 12. So as a consequence, most oracy work that I'm looking at is extracurricular and it's remedial. It's happening after school, as in after schooling has ended. And the kind of culture that I'm looking back on and wanting, in Karin's great phrase, to reactivate is about young adults devoting their free time, squeezing oracy speaking into leisure time, time that was competing with the pub, with family responsibilities, or with exhaustion after work. And some of this was solitary and private. People with modest incomes or skilled workers might have bought manuals of elocution or read magazines that were remarkably popular throughout the 19th century that would have taught them how to speak. Just like YouTube influencers today, this was big business, and it was often an autodidact kind of thing you did at home. But it was also something that took place in communities. Relatively affluent people or people with means might have gone to quite high-profile lecture courses about elocution in town halls, some of the mechanics institutes of the north that were very grand. Others might have relied on special societies that devoted themselves to social questions, and where oral traditions that Karin was talking about that are indigenous to Britain continued to flourish. And I want to give two examples. So one of them is the working men's club tradition. Let's take the oldest tradition, which is the oldest example that we have, which is the Working Men's Club in Coventry in the West Midlands, set up in 1862, and it was set up by weavers, and it had a games room, it had a reading room, and very specifically it had a discussion room, and the discussion room was mandated for use of discussion of topics of the day. And they had visiting speakers there, and one of the first people they had was someone to come and speak about elocution, something that continued through its life and only shut down in the 2000s. The second example is more about female speakers, and it's an example of a club that was set up in the Euston area by suffragettes. Emmeline Pethick Lawrence and other suffragettes in the 1890s set up a club called the Esperance Club, the Hope Club, that was set up to encourage local match girls and Irish immigrants to get together to talk, to express themselves and to engage in discussion of the issues of the day, but also to be part of this thing that's called vocal culture, to express themselves and to take pride in their articulacy and become, in long term, worthy of the vote in the eyes of society. So I think it's important not to romanticize this world of elocution and oracy. It was often really top down. It was often really to do with lots of conservative politics around temperance that we might have mixed feelings about now, improving the character and condition of the working classes. But it was something that was operating way beyond organized schooling, way beyond academic or traditional educational settings. And it was something that had a very powerful life that can be reconstructed and reactivated. This was a real part of people's lives. It was far from marginal, and it was far from untraditional. This was as traditional as anything that entered the curriculum.
Thanks, Tom. And I suppose, I mean, you say not to forget about the top-down elements of it, but this is also bottom-up as well, right? So this is also people wanting, you know, this isn't kids being dragged into school and being made to sit and listen to the teacher or be taught by the teacher. It's about people wanting to learn, to speak better, essentially, isn't it? Which I suppose that focus, or losing that focus around schools, well, for me anyway, I suppose encourages me to think about it a little less formally and to think about it as something that people want to do, and around the kind of more pleasurable or the more enjoyable purposes of oracy. Karin, I know this is something you're interested in terms of that, and I suppose you started talking about a little bit in terms of the proverbs and so on, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about that and that enjoyable side of speaking.
Yeah, I think pleasure is really the key to the whole thing. So thanks for the question. I think people everywhere take delight in language. This is something I became most aware of when I was doing research in Nigeria, where I was constantly struck by the way people remembered and quoted choice phrases, and they picked up new slang and circulated it. And then elders absolutely loved sitting down and explaining the origin of proverbs or the meaning of names and praise epithets. Sometimes the explanations were so elaborate that they would lead into other proverbs, other narratives, and so forth. So there was a whole terrain that people would journey through in their enjoyment of language. People really relished the words that they used. I worked for a time with a popular traveling theatre in Nigeria, where the plays were all unscripted and improvised. So it was an oral form. But the leader of the company thought very carefully about the words that he wanted us, the performers, to use. He had ideas about how the dialogue should unfold. He said it has to click. And he would spend a lot of time thinking out really memorable, exciting phrases, either as a launch pad for the sequence of dialogue that was going to follow, or as the punchline. And when it worked and the audience would react with ecstatic shrieks of amusement and approbation, then we knew that we got it right. So this kind of pleasure in language, I would think, is expressed all over the place in people doing wordplay. People enjoy making puns. They like unusual turns of phrase. They love quoting resonant expressions, like the quotation from Oliver Cromwell that we heard in the House of Commons last week. And these forms of linguistic pleasure, I would suggest, often show people's interest in the nature of language, because you have to understand how grammar works, on the potential that words have to mean different things if you're going to perform these feats of wordplay. So I was thinking maybe language games, fun with language, could be brought into the classroom, because kids actually already have the means and the skill to do things with words. And it could be recognized through letting them enjoy it in the classroom as well as in the street.
Tom or Joanne, did you want to come in on that question while waiting for Alan to?
Joanne, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so all I was, what I was thinking about is the recent work that's been done on Shakespeare, actually, as a rhetorician, as someone who is fully embedded and was fully educated in this sort of tradition that I've been talking about, and that carries through to this tradition around oracy today. And so really, you know, at least in the sort of English and sort of Anglophone, I guess, culture, this our greatest sort of example, I guess, of a wordsmith, Shakespeare, is using these rhetorical traditions, and so this pleasure that we find in not just using words but playing with them, I think is really important.
Yeah, I'm back on now. Can you hear me?
We can.
Apologies for that. I don't know. I'll just restart that just for the sake of clarity. What I was saying was that there is a risk, I think, in the way we describe Oracy, that we overemphasize the functional, you know, the business about getting things done with words, of using talk to be very purposeful in our lives. And that's absolutely critical. But I think there is a risk that we miss something there and neglect the pleasure that comes just from the sheer flexibility and immediacy of using language, particularly using language together. And I was just thinking about this. If you think about the way that infants learn to speak in the first place, yes, learning to talk is a brilliant way of making your needs known so that your parents do the things you want them to do. But it's also a huge source of pleasure. And I'm just reflecting, I've got three young grandsons now, but I was thinking back to my own son when he was 3, and he was looking out the window, the upstairs window, on a very frosty morning. And there was a chap down below just scraping his windscreen, scraping the frost off his windscreen. And my son turned to me and he said, "Daddy, why is that man shaving his car?" And I thought that, you know, there's a fantastic example of linguistic virtuosity emerging. Or I think of my 4-year-old grandson now, who is just obsessed with knock-knock jokes. He doesn't quite get them right, but he's got the form and structure of the joke, and he's playing with those. So there's something about the pleasure principle in language, which we tend to neglect. Picking up on what Karin's saying there, you know, the relish that you get. I have a particular interest in storytelling, in oral storytelling, and I think it's much neglected in schools and more widely. Not totally, there's great work out there. So I would just make a plea, I think, for looking at that as a context in which rapport, relationship, relish, all of those alliterative terms can come to play at any particular moment. So I think I think talk's its immediacy, the fact that it fizzes with ideas, is just as important as the value of talk for uncovering untruths or probing serious issues.
Thanks. Moving from fizzing onto maybe what might be seen as more serious issues, or, well, more formal issues maybe, but I wanted to think a little bit more about citizenship now, because we've talked, obviously the title of the project is Speaking Citizens. We've talked about speaking, we haven't yet talked about citizens. So I want to ask what's the relationship between articulacy and citizenship? Tom, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, so the notion that you have to be articulate to be worthy of citizenship is quite an old idea. It's something that I'm sure Joanne will know from her period. You know, the idea of the informed citizen, it's very close to the idea of the articulate citizen, but it's a very strange idea when you think about it. And it's an idea that's been used as a reason not to make certain kind of people full citizens, immigrants, women, working class people. And I think the most recent way you can see it in a really vivid way, not the most recent, I'm showing my age here, but 15 years ago, let's say, the moral panic around figures and caricatures such as Vicky Pollard in British sitcoms, the notion of her, yeah, but no, but yeah, that's mocking inarticulacy. But really what it's trying to do there is talk about someone who's indecisive, someone whose inarticulacy is about being unable to be a reliable member of a political community. And so I think that's one of the important elements, that inarticulacy has often been weaponized by various political programs, and it's still done so to this day. And it's the mocking of chavs on TikTok is back, just as it is going backwards to the period that I look at. So yeah, there's a larger claim about empowerment and citizenship, and I think that that's definitely an important aspect of why articulacy is important to citizenship. But I would emphasize something else. I think articulacy and citizenship is about successfully negotiating disagreement. It's about explaining, clarifying, listening well, listening critically, and bridging the gap between each other in an articulate way. It's about the glue, articulacy being the glue that binds society together. And I think that's what the focus of Oracy and the future of Oracy should be on. That rather than simply empowerment, it's about living together. It's about managing disagreement through listening and speaking. So that's what I would say, but I'll hand on to the other.
Well, John, maybe we could hear from you and go backwards in time this time.
Yeah, it's quite interesting going backwards, because for the people that I work on writing in the 16th century, they're often trying to create an idea of citizenship where it otherwise might not exist, because of course we're talking about a context of monarchy, and so they're trying to turn subjects really into citizens. And one of the tools by which they do that is teaching rhetoric, so that people can participate. There's a lot of emphasis on deliberation. So what Tom was sort of saying around debates and conflicts, on deliberation and how to deliberate, how to come to what they would call a prudent political decision, one that takes into account the past to think about the future and make a decision in the present. And absolutely, this was an elitist idea. It was exclusive in all sorts of ways, including towards women who were often thought not to have that faculty of prudence and thus deliberation. That all being said, there is a way in which it could be used to make things more sort of open and accessible. So I work on a woman, for instance, towards the end of the 16th century, named Anne Dowrich, who was a political writer, one of the very few political writers who were women at that time. And she is well versed in rhetoric. She's been educated in rhetoric, and she uses that in order to participate politically in situations where otherwise, of course, she would be excluded. And although that's in writing, she does it by writing speeches for other characters. She sort of ventriloquizes them. So that blurry line between literate and oral culture. And so there's this way in which rhetoric becomes empowering and can be sort of open up a public sphere to a wider group of people than had maybe been intended.
Thanks, Joanne. Karin, is there something that's kind of pertinent to your research?
Yeah, there's a Yoruba concept of good citizenship in a very broad sense, not to do with your actual political legal status, but how to be a good asset to the community. And that concept is omoluabi, which means a responsible, self-respecting person who does things right and who is of benefit to the community that they live in. So becoming an omoluabi involves learning how to interact properly with other people. So it is quite similar to learning rhetoric, learning ways of speaking which are approved in particular situations. So you have to learn how to respect, how to show respect for other people, how to pay attention to what other people are proposing. At the same time, how to hold your own in a discussion, how to handle delicate situations with tact, and show proper gratitude when people have done something for you. And all this is manifested in effective and appropriate speech. So it's very much a matter of mastering the ways of speaking. So learning speaking arts and skills is really the basis of self-realization as a rounded person, which is inseparable from being a good citizen or good member of the community. But beyond that, speaking in this conception is about rapport. It's about connection with other people. There's a Yoruba proverb which says, we say half a word to the omoluabi, the self-respecting good citizen, a responsible person, you say half a word to the Omoluabi, and when it gets inside them, it becomes whole. In other words, speech is a joint creation. It's inherently collaborative. So it's where two consciousnesses or more meet and construct something together. And therefore, that is how shared values are evolved. And note that it's the self-respecting and responsible person who is able to complete the half word and make it whole. So speaking well is creating the rapport that creates community. So I think that's a very fruitful kind of concept of citizenship, which we might be able to explore in our own context as well.
Thanks, Karin. I mean, I think all of the speakers so far, all of the answers so far, all add up to the kind of the importance of oracy and why this concept in all these different places and time periods is so important. Given that, Alan, why has it been so hard for oracy to be implemented in schools then?
I thought you might come to me on that one. Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? There's a kind of complex picture here, I think, from a school perspective. Just a few thoughts in no particular order. I think, I mean, in one sense, it's just the nature of the language mode itself, isn't it? Because spoken language is ephemeral, it's words on the air. It's very hard to do what schools want to do so much with what goes on there, which is to pin it down, to assess it, to evaluate it, to find the evidence for it. So in one sense, promoting oracy runs a little bit counter to what schools feel they are about in terms of their accountability, the need for evidence of learning. And talk often gets relegated, if that's the right word, to being an accompaniment to learning, rather than, as we're describing it here, being the learning itself. So, and at best, it's an accompaniment. At worst, it's seen as a distraction to the business of school. You know, stop talking and get on with your work. So I think there's something about talk itself which is tricky. Secondly, until very recently, I don't think teachers, schools have had a very good workable map, if that's the right word, of the range of skills, of the repertoire, if you like, that we're wanting young people to develop as speakers and listeners. That's changed and recently, as I mentioned, but that map has not been there. And so it's been a kind of vague concept, unlike other aspects of the curriculum, which are very neatly described. Thirdly, I think teachers would say they haven't often been adequately trained in the pedagogic skills of knowing how to manage classroom talk, manage talk in schools, in groups, or as a whole class. So they very often, it's not part of their background. And so what they tend to do as teachers is go back on the way they've been taught in order to manage classroom talk. And if they've not been taught that well, if it's been closed questions, then they'll tend to do that. So there's something about training, I think, which is part of the problem. The fact that talk is very much often a political football as well, as I said, over the last 30, 40, 50 years, successive administrations and secretaries of state have either promoted it or demoted it. So there have been mixed messages from the centre as to the importance of this as well, which hasn't helped, I don't think. And then probably I think another issue here is that children themselves very often won't themselves have a culture of valuing talk, unlike how Hester's describing it. I don't think many of our children in school recognise themselves the value of why they would talk. So even if a teacher tries to promote it, the children might resist it or not understand it or not know what's expected of them. So I think that can get in the way as well. And then teachers themselves may often see oracy as a potentially risky undertaking. It's difficult for them often to understand how you might manage classroom talk so that behaviour doesn't suddenly become an issue for you. So I think that oracy can be seen as a risk in the view of many teachers. So there's a kind of complex picture there of why it's difficult. But if you get high quality CPD linked to a school which values it and is able to build up children's understanding and teachers' understanding over time, then I don't think it's that difficult, to be honest. But you have to work at it and give it status to start with.
Well, hopefully we can through this project, do our own very, very small little bit to try and raise our status. I have one final question, and there's a couple of questions coming in the Q&A. So please if you're on the floor, please do add to the Q&A and we'll have a bit of time at the end. But my final question to everybody is summing up one. So if you had to sum up why good oracy mattered in a sentence, what would you say? Tom, should we start with you?
Okay, good oracy. I put this to David Blunkett, you would have heard it an hour ago, and he came up with a good answer. But my answer, good oracy means feeling confident when you open your mouth, you have the abilities to successfully relate and connect with other people. That's how I would concisely put it.
Thanks, Tom. Joanne?
Sure. Well, I'll probably just steal from my humanists and say that for better or for worse, the pen or the spoken word is mightier than the sword.
Thank you. Karin?
Oracy is the living connection between people, and it's also an incredibly rich site of creativity and pleasure.
And Alan?
They're all such short sentences, which is great. Mine's a bit longer. I think I want to say it matters from a young person's point of view. If a young person can develop a repertoire of speaking and listening skills so they can apply them to a range of situations confidently, as Tom was saying, if they can do that, that builds self-esteem and confidence. It makes you feel good about yourself and your place in the world. And that's about versatility. It's about eloquence and expressiveness. It's about agency and articulacy, and it's for life and learning. So I think it's absolutely central to everything we're about when we're thinking about how schools work.
Wow, that's wonderful responses. Very kind of inspiring in terms of thinking about how important this is. So we've got a little bit of time at the end, because that's finishes my questions. There's various things coming in the Q&A. There's a lot of there's some praise for this idea about Viz, I suppose, but the games and the creativity of oracy. There's a question about listening, and this came up earlier in the afternoon as well, actually. So there's a question: how can we make listening as important as speaking, as we try to spread the importance of how can we make listening as important as speaking, when to many people oracy is about talking and winning the argument? Alan, would you have some thoughts on that?
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it, that it's partly the way in which we describe oracy, firstly, to make sure that listening is always included when we're talking about it, that we don't fall into that trap of thinking that it's about producing sounds as opposed to responding to them. From a classroom point of view, I guess what I would say is it's up to the teacher to create the conditions where young people realize that listening to each other and in interaction with each other is absolutely essential for the learning they're doing. So, for example, just to give a very practical example, when we think about whole class dialogic teaching, in other words, the teacher working with a group of children, group of students, and trying to get them to interact with each other, to build on what each other says or to add to another person's point, it's the teacher who has to make those moves, what are now often called talk moves in dialogue. So the teacher needs to be able to say, who can add to what someone has just said? Who would like to build on what Hester just said to us? Does anyone disagree with that comment? So it's the teacher managing it so that the students realize they've got to attend to what each other is saying. And the best way of doing that, as well as the teacher doing that, is to get the seating right in a classroom so that you can all see and hear each other. Too many classrooms are set up so that you're looking at the backs of other people's heads when you're being asked to interact. So I would just say, think about your seating arrangements so that you're a community and you can see each other. And then the teacher has a very important role in making the moves that enable the children, enable the students to have to listen to each other so they can interact in the way that we'd want.
Thanks, Al. Does anyone else want to come in on that? Tom, you look as though you're about to unmute, are you, or not? You're on mute, Tom.
Sorry, I saw Joanne go first, but
I mean, go ahead. All I was going to say is that I'm picking up all sorts of things from my own teaching from Alan, so I'm really appreciating this. And just to introduce a 16th century word that I think is just fantastic and that we all should be using, which is nodcrafty, which is the art. We might think of it as active listening today, which is the art of actually nodding and listening and responding sort of physically. So we should all be nodcrafty. That's all I was going to say.
Maybe especially on Zoom, right? Tom?
No, I didn't have much to add from a historical perspective, because it's very difficult. It's very difficult to comprehend the listening practices of the past, except that the culture that I am beginning to piece together archivally is as much about conversation as it is about performance, and it's often about the body. And the way in which Alan was speaking about physical arrangement and how pedagogy relies on space, I think is one of the ways that you can pursue that. But I think it's it's the crucial theme which is emerging from this conference so far. It's not one which I have a great deal to add to, but I'm thinking about it, and some of the other questions I can definitely come back on. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thanks. So there's another question about, so we talked about the overlap of Oracy with fun, and Stephen Coleman, who's another member of the Speaking Citizens team, has put a question in about the overlap between pleasure and citizenship, which actually I was the one who put those in separate boxes, but of course they overlap as well. So his question is, can speakers talk about civic practice as fun as well? So in whatever order, whoever wants to go to comment first.
I mean, I'm happy to give a historical example again, if that's useful, because absolutely, and probably the way I described the 16th century reflections on rhetoric was a bit dry. But this is, as I mentioned, is also the age of Shakespeare, who was certainly having lots of fun with language and often in a very political way. But it's also the period of people like Erasmus and Thomas More, who are making arguments about civic engagement through rhetoric, but doing it in ways that are poking fun. I mean, I laugh when I read More's Utopia. I might be the only one who does that, but I think it's hilarious. They are trying to make jokes, and in fact, they're making jokes, and their wordplay is a form of political intervention for them, because they're making fun of their as we might say, punching up. They're making fun of those in power, and particularly making fun of the trappings of power and the pride of those in power. So it all sort of comes together. It's both a political intervention and a political critique. It's also at least meant to be hilarious, and it's all based on sort of wordplay and rhetoric, all sort of woven into one.
Thanks, Joanne. So, Tom?
Yeah, I didn't want to jump in unless if anyone else wants to. I think one of the things that seems to bring those two things together is this idea of role play. If citizenship is a form of role play, adopting different roles within a political community, within a civic entity or a polity, there is something to be said, and this is something which comes from the historical archive that I work with, about people trying on different roles through speech, whether it's through the impersonation or the through performing different speeches, or whether it's through debating societies and discussion groups that deliberately, as in many kind of debating techniques, flip the roles in which you were forced to inhabit the roles of you were forced to counter your argument. These kind of things are ways, I think, that you can gain appreciation and pride and empathy and all of these civic emotions really that are bound up with role play. Just to give one example from the 19th century, and it's one which comes not from Britain, from America. So one of the most popular books in the 19th century in America was this book called The Columbian Orator, and it was a collection of speeches, and it was speeches from the ancient world, but it was also speeches from Britain in the 18th century, but also the 19th century, and it was lots of different roles for and against major issues. And one of probably the most famous and consequential reader of this was Frederick Douglass, the fugitive slave, or well, the slave, when he learned how to read illegally, he learned how to speak, and he learned about rhetoric through this book. Him and his friends, some of whom were slaves, some of whom were not, used to perform for each other from this book. They used to take great pleasure in the civic roles of arguing for and against different positions. And he talked about it throughout the rest of his life as giving him a sense of civic discourse and rhetoric, but also a sense of the enjoyment and the essential role that artifice and a certain theatricality has in any kind of successful civic practice. So I think you've got various elements there you've got that are fun, but are important. So you've got ideas of enjoying different roles, but you've also got the goals of empathy and versatility and flexibility which come with that kind of practice as well. So that's just one example, but I can see role play as one of the key ways in which you can bring those together.
We are just about out of time. Got about a minute left, but I think it's probably time to draw it to a close there. This has been an amazing afternoon. From when did we start? 1 o'clock. And thanks particularly to this roundtable, which has been fabulous.